My name is Jim Hittman, and I was born in Milwaukee and raised in a little town about 35 miles out of Milwaukee called Muskego. When I was 14 years old, I started working in a gas station and working on cars, changing tires, changing oil, and so forth like that. I went to high school with a good friend whose dad had a trucking company. And when I was 16, I went to work for the trucking company in the garage and was a mechanic's apprentice, if you would say, and started on changing truck tires, which was a fun part of occupation. I learned that I wanted to do something different than that. We had the cages, and if you didn't have the cage, you had to chain them up individually, put 3 chains around them. And I had a very good life experience with that. I had a guy that worked at the shop that decided he was going to change the split ring tire and not chain it, and it blew off and didn't kill him, but he got seriously hurt. So the safety regulations were something that I got a life lesson in early. In high school, we had a very good auto mechanics class, and I was involved when I was a junior in high school. Back then it was called the Plymouth Troubleshooting Contest. Plymouth sponsored this through the high schools, and myself and another guy from my school, we were a team, and we competed in the Wisconsin State contest, and we won the contest, which put us into the national contest that was held at the Indianapolis 500 Speedway. And so we did that, and of course my best remember of that was when we got done with the contest in Indianapolis, they let us drive new Plymouth Challengers around the track, but they told us we had to keep it under 80 miles an hour. But on the Indy 500 track, wow, what an experience. So that was kind of my early days and in high school. That would be in 1968. So that was those were, I believe it was the Plymouth Challenger, if that back then, or Barracuda, whatever it was, but it was one of the hot cars. It was kind of fun. So from that point, I was 16 then, and I continued working in the trucking industry all through college. When I went to college, it was at Stout State University in Menominee, Wisconsin. When I started as a freshman, that's what it was, and when I graduated, it was the UW Stout, went into the University of Wisconsin system. And Stout was a technical college. It was a 4-year degree in power mechanics and vocational education, both at the same time. And in my working history on the trucks, I worked my way through college working for my buddy's dad, and I got involved that they started into the refrigerated business, and I started working on Thermo Kings. And I went to a Thermo King beginning training class in Minneapolis for 2 weeks, and then I was working on truck refrigeration, and that's really where I got into the refrigeration and air conditioning in my history, I guess I would say. And then when I graduated from college, I first went to work for a dairy out in southern Wisconsin, and I was working on their refrigeration units. And then I went from working on refrigeration units at a dairy to work for Mack Truck in Milwaukee as a technician. Worked there for a couple of years, and then I got hired by Thermo King in Minneapolis as a training instructor, because I had my education degree from college in technology. So I went to work for Thermo King. I worked for Thermo King for 5 or 6 years in their training division, which is the place that I got a lot of my training from the other instructors there. I worked at a few things in Thermo King. I was mostly in their training division, but then there was a slowdown in the early middle 70s, and so I got moved over to service parts division for a while. But the training division, we trained all over the world. I did training in Asia and Canada, a lot of places all across the country. And at that time, Thermo King had what they called mobile training buses. We would drive these 40-foot buses that had mobile classrooms in them all across the United States, putting training on right at the dealerships. That was back in the 70s. The neat part about the buses were they were old mobile post-off buses, 40-foot buses, and Thermo King bought these old buses, and in the training division we actually totally tore the buses apart, built the classrooms in them, totally renovate the buses in the training division. The whole inside of the bus was a classroom. Yeah, there you could get 12 students in it, and it had a lot of the mock-ups that they use for Thermo King for the training and the mock-up places. So it was a great experience, and I learned a lot of technical knowledge on it. And that's how I really started in the air conditioning business, both refrigeration on the refrigeration units, but back early, Thermo King actually sold automotive air conditioning. A lot of people don't realize that. And a good archive to go look up is go back to the archives of the Johnny Carson show from the late 1960s, and Thermo King advertised on the Johnny Carson show automotive air conditioning. So that's kind of how I got started in air conditioning to a degree. Now, how I ended up in Eau Claire was, of course, I was at Thermo King in Minneapolis. And when I left Thermo King in Minneapolis, I moved to Eau Claire and started my own transport refrigeration business. And I moved to the Eau Claire area at that time because around Eau Claire there were 5 meatpacking plants and a large number of transport refrigeration units. So when we started, the name of the company back then was Eau Claire Truck Refrigeration. And we started basically, it was myself and one other guy, and we basically, we worked out of a garage, a 2-stall garage. So when we worked on the truck refrigeration units, whether it was in the middle of the summer or the middle of winter, we worked outside because there was no room to put them in the garage. As we progressed at Eau Claire Truck Refrigeration, we finally got big enough and got a shop. And then once we got a shop and had room, then we actually started also getting into the cab air business, cab air repair. And that was probably in the late 70s. And that's how I really got going in the air conditioning business. I learned how to drive truck on a B model Mac. The 2 sticks, that was an interesting thing, and learning how to drive those, and I of course had a lot of friends in that area then, and I had one driver that was a very good friend of mine. He had his B model, and he had taken a torch and he had bent and got his shifting sticks. So when I shifted a B model Mac that had 2 sticks, I needed both hands to be, you had to stick your hand across and do it. He even made his so he could shift them with one hand. If you can drive a B model Mac, you can drive any truck. There were a lot of things where certain parts of certain organizations, like you'd have a company that was union, and they had certain runs that the union got in the thing that tractor had to have air conditioning in it. Yes, that was early on. But the trucking industry, really kind of grew up in it, and it went very, very, very well. Our company's first big foray into air conditioning, especially in the off-highway market, was on logging what they called feller bunchers. And our first major work was done up in Canada. And you'd think, well, air conditioning in Canada, they don't really need it. But we developed a kit for a piece of logging equipment that was turned 360 degrees. And it was what they called a feller buncher, where it cut the trees down, turned them over, and cut them off the lengths. And this was up in Canada. And in the summertime in Canada, it gets pretty brutal out in the woods. So we developed this kit to go into this machine so that they could have air conditioning in this cab. So I ended up doing a lot of work up there. And the interesting part, for example, was the first time I went up there, and it was in the middle of straight north of Minnesota in Canada, and the logging road to get into this logging camp was 80 miles long. This was an 80-mile long dirt road. So you drove back there, and when you finally did get to, and you had to have somebody that knew where they were going or you'd get lost. When you finally got to the logging camp, okay, there was a true logging camp where those guys stayed out there for 2 weeks at a time, and they had a bunkhouse and cooks and the whole, what you used to hear about logging camps. And so I get out there to work on this machine, and the first thing is the camp manager comes up to me and says, "What are you here for?" I said, "To work on the air conditioning on a logging machine." He said, "Oh yeah." He said, "I hate air conditioning." I said, "Oh, well, this doesn't sound good to start with." And he says, "I hate air conditioning, but you know what? I gotta have it." I said, "Okay, what do you mean?" And he says, "Come here, I want to show you something." He opens up and he shows his production book. Okay, he says, "See this machine here that you're to work on? When we first got it and got the air conditioning," he said, "here's the production." He says, "So you watch production. Production stays kind of steady all day long." He says, "See there, the air conditioning went out." He says, "So you look at the production during the day, the production goes way down. At night, because they ran them 24 hours a day, at night when it cooled off, production goes back up." So the guys can't stand them in there when it's so hot. And he says, and the second thing is then when it gets so hot in the cab, our measuring devices, which were early electronics at that time, got too hot in the cab. They didn't work correctly from the heat, and therefore instead of cutting the logs at 8-foot lengths, they cut them at 10, 12, 6. So he said, "I hate air conditioning, but I gotta have it." And that's really how we really got into the off-highway market, and it became a big part of our business. Not as much with camps like that, but the equipment is all like the Feller Bunchers, and everything is air conditioned now. And as it progressed in it, the guys would tell you, "We got air conditioning in here, and it ain't for the guy that's operating it. It's to keep that equipment cool and for the productivity of it." But that was the early days. That's not so much big in logging. That's more into your gravel pits and mining and that kind of stuff, you know. And we have, of course, you know, we started with logging was our big part in the off-highway, but now we're into all of the, you know, a lot with the off-highway stuff. And yeah, the landfills and the gravel pits, you know, MSHA regulations. So now the silica stuff is, MSHA is the mining regulation, the federal government. With the regulations now, cab pressurization and filtration is as big a part of AC and that kind of stuff as the AC is, because it's because of the regulations. Another industry with the regulations is the spraying industry, like crop spraying and even you know, like one of our big things are with air conditioning is one of our big customers is Toro lawnmowers. They have their bigger lawnmowers and they have their big sprayers, and the air purification on those sprayers is a big thing. Yeah, they use them for fertilizer. Yeah, it's a big tank on a looks like a little tractor, you know, but it's a spraying tank. Or they take the spraying mechanism off and put mowing mechanisms on, but it's a one-man cab. So we have gotten involved with that, and that's how one of the things how I got involved with all of this stuff and with our company and how we do that. And it's just it's been a migration of, I guess you want to say, technology. That is a big part of the industry today for cab stuff like you're talking about, the cab controls and stuff. That's part of it. Wisconsin is the Badger state. And the reason we changed the name is because we started doing the air conditioning stuff all over the place. So instead of calling it Eau Claire, which people said, "Where the hell is Eau Claire?" We changed it to Badger Truck Refrigeration. I think we changed to Badger Truck Refrigeration in about 1980. And that was when we started doing more and more, and that's also about the time, very late 70s or 80, we got involved with Red Dot. We became a Red Dot distributor. And at that point, we did work with, started with small OEMs, mostly logging equipment OEMs, that were built in the Wisconsin and Minnesota proximity. There was a number of logging equipment manufacturers, and that's how we really got going in the logging business. Some of them did. Yeah. Some of them did. Some of them, and we continued doing business with some of the big guys then. Like for one of our main logging customers was, at that time, was called Prentice Log Loaders, and they were bought out by CAT. And we continued doing business with CAT for a long time. In fact, actually until within the last 2 or 3 years, that CAT actually closed that plant, so now we don't supply them with anything anymore, other than service parts. So yeah, it was. So we had some of the big companies we did business with, but CAT was probably the biggest one. But a lot of the smaller OEMs. And actually, small OEMs has become our niche. Because you take an OEM that's going to build 50 pieces of equipment a year, the big manufacturers, that's not enough for them to mess with it. So, and that's how we got involved. When we got involved with Red Dot, we took a lot of Red Dot units and modified them to meet our customers' demands, and that worked out really good for us. And we eventually got to the point that we now have a sister company that actually builds units to whatever spec Badger truck wants. And it's all for specialty stuff. It's all low volume, but they actually build the units. So like we buy a lot of coils and so forth from Red Dot and build different housing for them and different plenums and those kind of things. So in essence, our business, we really started Badger Oakland truck refrigeration and Badger truck refrigeration on Thermo King business. We weren't a Thermo King authorized place, and then we became what's called an affiliate dealer of a Thermo King dealer, and then we became a Thermo King service dealer through Thermo King directly. And we were that way for quite a while. And then, like 4 years ago, Thermo King decided to get rid of all of their service-only dealers, and now we have gone back to be an affiliate dealer of the Thermo King dealer in Minneapolis. But kind of in essence, what's happened with our business is, in the early days, Thermo King was 85–90% of our business. Today, I would say Thermo King is 10% of our business. Our air conditioning, our heating and air conditioning, our HVAC business is 90% of our business. But I started it because of my experience with Thermo King. In the early 80s, we did a lot of installs of air conditioning systems on off-highway equipment. Front-end loaders, none of that stuff had air conditioning. It was all add-on, okay? And you look today, I don't think there's any big piece of equipment that's made that doesn't have air conditioning on it. So we don't do very much installs on the big stuff anymore, but we still do a few on that. But service of off-highway air conditioning is a very big part of our business. Yep, we have 4 guys, 4 service trucks on the road, and we do. Besides air conditioning, one of the other big things we've gotten into is fire suppression. We're a dealer for a big fire suppression. And so we do fire suppression in about 6 states in Wisconsin. You have machines at landfills and mines and so forth, they have automatic fire suppressions, and logging equipment is on the machine. Now they're a combination. They used to be all dry powder, and now with the new Tier 4 engines and the heat and so forth, they have a mixture because of the heat in the afterburner sections of them, they gotta have liquid. The rest of the machine is powder, so it's a kind of a mix. Where they're doing the DPF, you know, that stuff is very hot. The actual engine water temperature isn't that much higher than they used to be, but the after treatment area of the exhaust can have very hot areas. So, and that's become a big part of our business too, along with the off-highway service all over the place. And logging, of course, has been a big thing. I got involved with MACS. I actually was originally involved with IMACA. And so I joined IMACA way back. I think that was in like 76, 77. And I was in IMACA I was in IMACA until it went out, but I joined MACS probably 2 years after I joined IMACA. And one of the reasons I got involved with MACS is, well, IMACA was kind of falling apart, and it was a good organization for the training. Early on at Badger Truck Refrigeration, I got involved with SAE. I developed some 2-temperature fan kits for refrigerated trailers, which at that point you had to have something that you developed and did in order to get into the SAE. And I promote the SAE because the standards that you get from SAE is, and MACS, of course, works great with SAE, and that's how I got involved with MACS to begin with. And then, of course, MACA went away, and MACS was the place to be. I got involved with IMACA because of a guy that I got involved with at Thermo King from Dallas, back with the Thermo King air conditioning stuff, who recruited me to join IMACA for at that point, for the IMACA standards. Because when we started getting into developing units, some guys, say, well, you got to have some kind of standard. What are you using? Well, you had to find something. So that's how I got involved with IMACA. And then I joined MACS before IMACA went out because I saw what MACS was doing and I actually liked it better. I mean, and IMACA did some good stuff. And I got to say, at the end, IMACA realized that, it was better to have one organization than two, that one would be stronger. And I think that's what happened to IMACA is MACS started growing and was a good organization, and IMACA wasn't growing. So I still have IMACA certification. I still have my original IMACA card, which is still good. Now it's serviced through MACS. I mean, at our company, I do most of the training, and we do a lot for the railroad. The part of the railroad we work with is the track maintenance equipment. Back in the middle 80s, we developed kits for the Burlington Northern Railroad for their track maintenance equipment. Back at that time, they were getting into what you were speaking about earlier, the dust and so forth. Now, if you know anything about railroad track maintenance equipment, they have machines that go down that clean the track. They got brushes on them, and then they go down and scrape the rocks and all that and bring everything back up to what it's supposed to be in the beds. And when you see that machine going down, well, if it's dry, you don't see the machine. You see a cloud of dust going down the tracks. And they getting involved with air conditioning their cabs and pressurizing them with filtration because they got union suits from black lung, from the dust. So we developed some kits for them and did a lot of them in the late 80s and early 90s. So we got involved with the railroad and we do a lot of training for them. Oh yeah, they got grinders, they got, what I was just talking about is called a ballast regulator. That's a big thing. That the ballast is all the stones and all that stuff around that. But they got rail grinders, they got the spikers, they got, and in fact, our company, one of our bigger small OEM, couple of our bigger small OEMs are rail maintenance equipment companies. We supply them their HVAC systems. And we really got involved with that through the railroad recommending us. Yeah, we're a tier 1 supplier for an OEM that might build 50 machines a year. That's what we do. And of course, our specialty is a small one. Somebody comes to us and say, well, we want you to build us, 2,500 air conditioning systems. We say, you're not really talking to the right guys. There's a little history to that. It was started under the Badger. Okay, so what happened was, well, the real story goes back to, we had one of our logging equipment manufacturers that wanted a small heater in a certain configuration, and smaller and not the right configuration that we could get from Red Dot. So we decided, well, we'll build it ourselves. So I went to Red Dot and said, okay, I know you're not going to build this heater, but I need you to build me the coils. So they built some coils for us, and then we started building a heater. And then we continued on, and we ended up with we did that heater, and then we started taking some Red Dot coils and building a special evaporator for. So that was the beginning of us. Well, all right. So we started a little division where we built some of our own evaporators and heaters and so forth. Well, that went on for a little while, but then all of a sudden, Red Dot said, I don't know about that. Yeah. So then we decided, well, okay, so then we split that company off. One of the guys that was involved with Badger Truck took that company and made it a different name, was called Badge Air, and they were off on their own. Now, that was in about 2000. And that continued on that way for until 2013. And then they were, and at that point, Badger Truck bought almost most of their stuff, and then they got spread out, and they were doing stuff for other people too. But in 2013, they were about to go bankrupt, and Badger Truck couldn't let them do it because they made too much stuff for us. So I went back and took control of that company. It's still not part of Badger Truck. It's still a separate company, but eventually it will be part of Badger Truck again. So that company's called Badge Air, and that's really our sister company. So that's kind of where we are at right now as a company, and it's a big, the air conditioning, the heating and air conditioning is a big part of our business. Fishing. Well, I talked to you earlier about my Canadian, working on air conditioning up in Canada. Part of that got started by fishing up there, and actually the story I was telling you about that first camp that I worked in way back out in the woods. Well, we get out there, and I worked on the machine, and we installed the system and tested it and everything. Well, that was the second day that we were there. Then late in the afternoon we were done, and the machine was all working, and then one of the guys says, "You want to go fishing?" I said, "Of course I want to go fishing." He said, "Well, meet me back here in about 10 minutes. So I went to my truck, and I didn't have any fishing stuff with me. So you don't need it, just meet me back here. So I go back to where we were working on that machine 10 minutes later, and here he comes with a logging skidder with a aluminum bolt tied on behind it. And we drove out in the woods for about half an hour and came to a little lake, nobody on the lake, and throws in that aluminum bolt, and we went fishing. Great fishing. So so that was I don't know how many years ago that was. That was about 40 years ago, and I've only missed 1 year of fishing in Canada in 40 years. Back with the logging guys that I worked with, when I would go in and out with them, you're fishing on lakes that never been fished before. Yeah, so fishing, and I'm a hunter. I'm a deer hunter. I'm not a bow hunter, I'm a gun hunter. So that's what I do. That's what my recreation stuff is, yeah. One thing I think of the future, and one of the things that I promote because MACS is so good at it, is what the guys are going to need, the technicians are going to need the training. And training is a huge thing in my estimation. That if you want to be an independent company, the training is going to be your technician training and getting technicians. I mean, that is going to be a huge problem. I mean, I got to say, I have been very lucky up to the last couple of years. In my company, I had most of my technicians were farm boys, you know, so they were all good workers. They were, you know, weren't afraid of trying things and doing things and digging right in and doing the work. But nowadays, we've been short of technicians now for a couple of years, and you cannot, I mean, we're having, as everybody is, having a hard time finding qualified technicians, or even technicians that are willing to get the training that will actually do hands-on work. You have no problem finding a technician that would like to come in and troubleshoot for you and hook the computer up and look at things, but to actually, you know, do good troubleshooting and actually go in and repair something is getting harder and harder as the days go on. So I think training for the technicians that are interested in being very important.